So hi Rob, thank you very much
Hi,
for joining
how
us.
you doing?
I'm good, thank you. I'm good. Thank you for asking yourself.
Yeah, pretty good, pretty good. Nice rainy day here in Wiltshire.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it's somewhat brighter here in Portsmouth. So look, Rob, thanks for joining us. For the purposes of everyone watching, do you want to just give a quick background as to your background, history, and where you currently are?
Well, I'm currently in Marlborough, in Wiltshire, in my somewhat messy office. I must do something about my backdrop, but it never seems to get to the top of the list. Where have I been? Well, I started off a very long time ago as an accountant. Um, Rapidly moved through that, did a government training course in IT, and then joined the first of a series of retailers. So I worked for British Home Stores, now sadly defunct. Then I moved to Dixons, which later became Dixons Stores Group and is now TalkTalk, Carphone Warehouse, Dixons, Currys, PC World, whatever they are now. I've lost track. Then I moved into Great Mills, a DIY retailer, for 3 years. I was head of IT there, and then moved into a larger supermarket, which was then called Gateway Food Markets, then renamed itself as Summerfield, and has since been subsumed into the Co-op group. So yeah, you sadly don't see Summerfields anymore. And then I guess my big break came when Summerfield had one of their purges, and I found myself last in, first out. I've been head of business systems planning there. And I went to work with Vodafone. I ran an IT department for them, a small IT department in one of their service providers, which are the people who manage customers, and moved rapidly through a number of different roles with Vodafone. So I was head of IT, head of program management for all the technology products. Then moved into new product development, did a bit of time working in marketing on the mobile office products, the launch of various things targeted at business people, like BlackBerry, like the Mobile Connect card, which was the first time that we put something into a laptop that enabled it to talk to a mobile phone. And then did some more IT work, and then found myself without a job within a massive department in Vodafone UK. And I was offered to move across into procurement as the head of UK procurement. So my first procurement job was to run a procurement department, which was quite interesting, illuminating, and whatever. And I've been in and around procurement ever since. My three top skills are procurement, program management, and IT. And I think every role that I've done since combines at least two of those. So I left Vodafone in 2010. I was caught in possession of a UK contract, which meant it was far easier to give me a package and send me on my way than it was for a German or Italian. By then I was running a global department in Vodafone. So we parted company and I set up on my own. Did a few bits and pieces, and then ended up with 4C as a procurement consultant. And since then, I've done a number of CPO roles, interim CPO roles, and whatever. And I find myself now still looking at procurement as the primary thing that I'm doing, working with a number of companies, helping them do operational procurement, and also helping to sell procurement services into a variety of clients. And also doing training for people. So I've got what you call a plural career now. So that's it in a nutshell, Mo.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's fascinating. It really is. And I just want to touch on a couple of points that you mentioned there. So, how did you find yourself in your first role for procurement, suddenly running global operations for Vodafone?
Well, I was just running UK to start with, and it was a real eye opener, because I'd worked with the procurement people, especially in the job before, where I was organising major programs. So I was organising large tranches of IT work, large business transformations, and buying lots of stuff without necessarily being too aware of the procurement process. I'd obviously worked with some really good professionals there, Kendall Smith, Ginny War, and I moved over, and all of a sudden I was managing Ginny and a whole load of other people who I'd worked with over my previous 5, 6, 7 years in Vodafone. I found I've been doing it all wrong. You know, I've been ignoring tendering processes and ignoring guidelines and not really helping them, and doing all the sorts of things that that a senior manager in a hurry would do to try and circumvent the process. So we went back to basics. I learned procurement from the ground up, which was good because I had some really good role models to work with and for. Many of whom I'd worked alongside, and I now had either I was reporting to them or working or had them working with me. So that was good, and I was a sinner reformed. I became somebody who's an advocate of decent procurement, but I've also always, one of the things I live by is that procurement has to satisfy business needs. It has to first of all start with, what does your business need? Where is your business going? And I think that's particularly important in these COVID days.
And I think for, you know, your experience sort of lended to that, because I think coming, you know, you had an advantage in terms of coming from an IT program management perspective, which was very much about business delivery.
Yeah,
and then when you add on that procurement piece, that there's a natural alignment there. So I can understand where that came from. And then just talk a little bit more about training, Rob, that you're providing now. So what is that? I know that when we spoke before, one of the things that I really took away, and I thought that was really provocative, was the fact that you said this thing about it isn't about a race to the bottom for procurement. There's actually it's about managing that relationship. So just to, and you provide that as training as well, don't you? So just touch on that.
So we a few years ago now, more than 5 years, or 5 or 6 years ago, I fell in with a company that was then called Do Learn Do, and is now called Go Simulate. And it's a very, very small company, a niche provider of business simulations. And what they do is they have a really, really good computer simulation of a particular situation. And I specialize in 2 or 3 of them. The particular one that I work on a lot is strategic sourcing, which basically uses a day's worth of workshopping, or a longer workshop, to explain to people how you need to buy for value, and you need to think about long-term relationships. Even when you're doing competitive tendering, you need to be thinking about your long-term relationship. We run that with Vodafone. We run that with Unilever. I haven't managed to sell it to Vodafone yet. If anyone from Vodafone is listening, we'd love to hear from you. Run it with Unilever all around the world. Take a group of 40 or so people who are working on inventory management, or supply chain management, or procurement, or warehouse management, and take them through the process of not just buying on price. They compete together in teams, and over 5 or 6 years, I've done this 20 or so times with Unilever, and we've got really good results in just opening people up to the concept that there are more things that you can think about. We get very, very good reviews. We also do it for the MBA course at Cranfield. So we talk to guys at Cranfield, slightly different flavour, because then you're not dealing with a lot of people from a different culture. You know, I've been to Mexico, Singapore, Dubai, wherever with Unilever. The Cranfield one tends to be a little bit more bread and butter. You know, lots of people from the UK, and lots of people who are at the same stage of their careers and doing an MBA. So we tend to have some very, very sharp people there, and it keeps us on our toes. And there are other courses, but they're largely around the area of getting people to work together as teams, understand the problem, exchange information. We've just done our first one of those for Cranfield, entirely based on Zoom, with 31 people. Actually, in this case, they were stretched from Norway to South Africa, with a core in the UK. And that worked really well. We managed to actually flip the course so that although people were all sharing desktops and sharing teams, none of them were in the same building, which worked really,
Yeah.
really well. So very pleased with
Yeah.
that. So training moves on, and we're always looking for new ways of bringing people together using the very nice simulations that we've got.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant, Rob. And I think, again, it's really interesting because I feel, although I'm in a different sector, that training and training staff is something that organizations don't always prioritize. And also, again, we've seen the benefits of spending time on team training and trying to help people focus back on the priorities of supporting the business. And I think, again, to your point, some of the benefits that we've seen recently of the COVID situation is the fact that everyone's moved to different ways of being able to provide that training. And in your example there, you can get a classroom across the globe, which historically, there wasn't either appetite for, or just culturally didn't work. Whereas now it's almost become the norm over the last couple of months. So hopefully that will continue to be the norm within businesses. So I can understand your time at Vodafone, your engagement there. When you were there, did you have anything in terms of cybersecurity, or was that still relatively early, or was that things that you touched on within IT or your program management roles?
Yes, I mean the Vodafone always had a very, very strong grip on security. First of all, on the IT side, well, on the customer side, so three ways really. On the customer side, they had a lot of advanced technology. Even when I joined in the mid-90s, they were mapping networks of people using their phones and trying to detect people who were using false addresses, who are going to bunk off without paying for their subscription phones, and trying to help law enforcement with in various ways. So there was subscription fraud, people stealing money from Vodafone, and also the idea that people using phones, criminals using phones, could be tracked. And without putting too fine a point of it, there was a lot of work going on there, and that was working with the security services. And I think it's public. So, for instance, I'm very proud of the fact that Vodafone helped to capture and identify the Omar bombers, which was as part of the terrorist operations in Ireland, using tracking of mobile phones. That's one cyber aspect. Second one, IT security, is an awful lot of work to make sure that our systems were secure. We had 13 million customer details on our system, and an awful lot of sensitivity around call records and whatever. So at the time when, for instance, if you talk about what was called mobile phone hacking, there was an awful lot of people in Vodafone working on making sure that the mobile phones could not be hacked. And what was done was, if it was actually password hacking on phones, and we forced people to use non-obvious passwords on their voicemail, which was the root of the whole thing. But then moving on to my procurement role, I was heavily involved in cybersecurity from the point of view of what our suppliers were up to, and how to qualify suppliers and make sure that they were secure. And again, one thing I can talk about that's in the public domain, there's a lot that I can't talk about, but you'll obviously be aware of the discussions around Huawei and other Chinese suppliers. And as head of the China sourcing unit, and as the person responsible for Huawei as a global supplier, I can tell you that these discussions that are now public are not new, and they were going on. Discussions regarding 5G were going on regarding Huawei in antiquity, in 2007, 2008, and 2009. And again, as you can see now, steps are being taken by various governments, and they involve not only Chinese suppliers but other suppliers. So very much looking at your supplier integrity as a procurement person, and making sure, working with the technology people to make sure that what you deliver to the customer is robust and is not going to expose them to risk, with a variety of telecoms is a global business. It has global standards, and of the countries in the world, there are many, many countries that develop and deliver mobile technology, hardware, software, middleware, airside stuff, stuff in the core network, intelligent nodes. They come from everywhere. And so they all have to not only adhere to a common technical standard, but also adhere to common cyber standards. So at the time I left Vodafone, there were at least 3 groups looking at cybersecurity from the customer point of view, from the IT point of view, and from the mobile network service point of view, all of which were separate domains.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I'm smiling, Rob, because it's music to my ears. And what I love about this as well, I mean, if you know, if anybody that's listening is aware, the National Cyber Security Centre have you know, posted for a long time, supply chain remains one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest routes in for attacks, for hackers. So looking at the work that you guys were doing, you were really innovative to be doing it at that level in 2007. You know, so
way back to the 90s. You know, the first, there was a guy called Ray Green who ran security at the first service provider that I worked for, and he was there showing networks of consumers, networks of customers, and trying to identify with the help of credit agencies where those customers might be defaulting on their subscriptions before they were defaulting, and that led into identifying networks of criminals in conjunction with the police forces. And that was in the mid-90s.
Yeah, I mean, that's great to hear. My perspective on this is it isn't as broad across industry as it should be. Is that your take? I mean, and I tell you my thinking here. I think that large organizations, certainly global organizations, may have the processes, the people, and the technology to monitor that. Once you start to move down those levels, there may not be that level of integrity there. And just to add to that, some of the other complexity that we see is contracts that have been signed 15, 20 years ago, where there's just a renewal process going on. Often the risks that we see today across supply chain weren't even understood, so therefore they weren't captured. So what I see when we're having engagements now with new suppliers that are coming on board and we're asking them security questions, you can tell their maturity because they either understand it immediately and can respond to you, or there's some translation difficulties that happen. So what's your thoughts on that, Rob?
Yeah, I think if you're selling into the corporate market, you are going to be asked the same security questions, or hopefully variations on the same security questions by every corporate. When you move down to SMEs, you're likely to have much more of a patchy response depending on the industry they're in. I think the exposures are the same and the opportunities are the same to use all the different cyber frameworks that are out there to make sure that your suppliers are, you know, looking after data. I guess GDPR was a good thing. Applied very patchily at the moment. I think people are still doing things that, as a GDPR, or somebody who's kind of dabbled with GDPR for people, some of the things they're doing are not necessary, and also missing out necessary things that they should be doing in terms of qualifying their suppliers and making sure that they know where their data is going, for instance. And making sure that there is a boundary. I think there's companies, large, medium, and small, who get the wrong end of the stick with the legislation. The legislation is there to help and protect you, and it's not there as an invitation for you to generate large amounts of new bureaucracy. So one aspect of GDPR that irritates me is people seeking to renew GDPR approvals after a year or so. Well, that's not part of the legislation, and it's not necessary. And if you have a legitimate reason to do business with somebody, if you're doing business with somebody, you don't need to go nuts on approvals all the time. So that's for me that's an irritation. But that's more about data security than cyber attack.
Yeah, and I agree with you there, Rob. I think the interpretation for GDPR is is still broad, and different organisations take different perspectives, and it's strange because I think most of the supporting material is quite clear. So I'm not sure why that happens, but that interpretation seems to be dependent on the organisation or the supporting consultancy that's doing that, and I'm not sure what the drivers are. Well, I think I know, but I'm not going to share those publicly. But
what I'm doing, I mean, I was thinking about this yesterday. I was doing some work with an organisation that is seeking to reopen its activities, a little private organisation, not a business. And we were talking to various people, and Wiltshire Council were giving advice, and I thought it was the wrong advice. So I went back to gov.uk and pulled out the what we were looking for, which were the regulations on opening premises. You know, who can open premises, as simple as that. And when you go back to the original document, if you go back to the GDPR, I forget it's something like section 29, and it lists the 6 reasons that you need to get approval for your for data movements, and all of your duties as a custodian of the data. It's all there in the legislation. It's there, and you can just go through it. But are we part of this or not? And I would say if you get into that sort of situation, go back to the original legislation, because these days it can be as clear as anything. You know, the COVID legislation, people might criticize it for being vague, but if you're running, you know, a snooker hall, say, for instance, you can just run your list down all the places that are allowed to open and say, yeah, snooker hall, it's here. A model village, yeah, it's here, we can do that. Yeah. If you're in a community centre, you can do this, this, and this, but not this, and it's there in the government procedures or the government proclamations. So there's no reason for over elaborating or being in doubt or calling it confusing, because you can just go back to the original text.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I think we'll swerve away from GDPR because it may consume the whole,
yeah, let's get off that subject.
It'll consume the whole conversation. But let me just touch back on that supply chain bit. So one of the things that we in the cybersecurity industry always point back at is the supply chain. At the moment of that initiation and that management is via procurement and legal, right? So yeah, you know, the responsibility and the opportunity to really capture things such as the data classification, and that data classification falls into the GDPR piece, the risks to the organization, or how that data is to be stored and how that data is going to move around the world. A lot of that is captured at the initial, even starting from the RFP process, right? So what's going to be provided, how it's going to be provided, what data classification is. Yeah. So it feels like that the right place for that triage and management to happen is via procurement, and then it feeds into cybersecurity or IT as part of that process for onboarding into the organization. However, we've spoken about this for a while, and I'm not aware, and I'm not sure that everyone agrees that process does happen. That process does happen, but whether it captures those cybersecurity parts or not, I'm not sure. What are your thoughts on that?
So let's go back a few years. I was working for Gartner, and I was working at a well-known online insurance company, and we were trying to put together an RFP for the outsourcing of the support of their major claims system. So this is a strategic system for them. The RFP was hundreds of pages long, and the first thing I did with my colleague Chris Linfoot, we worked together, and we printed out all of these hundreds of pages, and we literally were completely boggled by the amount of information that was required. I won't talk about the cyber bit. Let's talk about the testing bit. So testing had done a really good job, because they're testers. They'd itemized every single way in which the outsourced partner should test the system. And there was 140 requirements to be measured for testing, which is great. There were hardly any requirements for what the systems had to do, or availability or reliability, but for testing, we absolutely had that nailed. And because testers are great at writing out test plans and they have all this material, so they just, basically put a not very shortened version of their test plan into the RFP. So I said, is there any way we can shorten this? We talked to people, is there any way we can shorten this? And they said, well, and I forget the precise number of the standard, let's just say it's ISO 40077. I said, well, why don't you just say, please comply to ISO 40077 rather than having these 145 requirements, all of which are the decomposed version of that. And I think from that lesson, which I learned then, and we produced a really good, we actually literally cut and pasted the 140 or so pages of rubbish down to about 20, literally by chopping the pages up and putting the duplicates in a big pile and putting in too much detail in a big pile. And then we could see where the gaps are. My thing was, well, if you just simply describe, we want you, Mr. Supplier, to do this, to produce these outcomes to the following standards, then you've really got any RFP in a nutshell. If you're describing the outcomes, you're describing the standards they have to be delivered in, and you're describing exactly what you want to do. And if you can use ITIL or a similar structured way of describing it, then you can really make your RFPs sing from the point of view of the customer, that the supplier is likely to understand exactly what you want and be able to provide the right product for you, and it's likely to be a product he's just got on his shelf rather than something he has to bespoke for you. So that was a good lesson, and I think cyber fits. Very long answer to a very short question. I think cyber fits into that particular aspect. If you can identify the standards you want your supplier to meet, and put that right at the start of the process, then you're going to get a much better response, a much better tender response. And you won't be trying to assess a supplier against 140 different things. You'll be able to say to them, demonstrate to me how you meet this following standard. What's your proof that you comply with this standard? Have you been audited? Have you got the audit results? Rather than actually say, well, okay, about this particular microscopic thing, do you do that? Do you insist that every router has its password and SSID changed when it comes into the business? You just need to know that people are audited and they're following the standards, and then you can probe in and things you're interested in. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, I'm nodding profusely and smiling because I really like that idea of outcomes driven, and I think to your point as well, if you can consolidate what it is you want to as a response, it makes it not only clearer to the responders, but also when you're doing the gap analysis around, trying to differentiate between the responses, it's very clear. And I think to your point as well, you can get lost in the detail. And then as you come back up, it's very difficult again to differentiate that. So what I certainly see from a cybersecurity point is there's twofold really. You'll find organizations, for example, if you say, are you ISO 27001 compliant, they'll show you that they've had this certification. And then you'll ask them, actually, how do you protect this data? And they go, we don't. We don't. It's kind of like, do you use two-factor authentication, or do you use encryption? And they go, no, we don't. So I think again, there's that, as that gets filtered through, it helps eliminate or separate the wheat from the chaff. But I think again, what we're trying to do is be very much focused on outcomes, because often what we try and do, and there's a piece of work that the NCSE did on the NIST-D directive, which was utility sector critical national infrastructure, and when they were doing the mapping, it was very much focused on the outcomes. So the question historically, if it was an audit question, the audit question would be like, do you have a SIM? And the answer would be, yes, we do. And you go, great. So this is a security incident and event management system. Do you have that? Yes, we do. So they rephrased that, and the outcome was, have you identified the risks that your organization is trying to protect from? And do you have the capability within your SIM to detect and respond to that? And the answer to that would be no. Actually, we haven't done that work. So, to your point, the outcomes are fundamentally what you're trying to achieve. And I think there's an output is having the system, and an outcome is what's being driven out of that system.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And if you find that every one of your suppliers, after all that probing, can meet the objectives, then you're down to what's really important about the suppliers is, as in, can we work with these people? You know, do these people show a positive understanding of our business? Do these people share our values? And are these people likely to share their best engineer, their best innovation, their greatest cost-saving ideas with us? Because that's really what it's all about in a good supplier relationship. Are they in for the long term, and will they share their expertise with us, or are they just going to sit and take our money? And I think if you can clear away quickly and easily the all of the standards they have to adhere to, and probe them and test them, but then look them in the eyes and say, are these people we want to deal with? Because I think when you have a choice, often these days you get 3 or 4 great suppliers, but you gel with 2 or 3 of them, and then you can have a meaningful commercial discussion with those 2 or 3.
Yeah, again, I love that.
In the public sector, but I think it should be how the private sector works, and maybe the public sector could think a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. And again, I think those strategic partnerships, as you say, are and you know, I was just going to say we've been through recently during this lockdown, we've been through an RFP process and got down to final select, and that's been really interesting in trying to do that via conference calls, whereas you going into a meeting room and having a presentation and spending some time with those people is always really important, because you get a gauge. To your point, this is a strategic partnership. It's not a service. It is a service offering, but it's supposed to be a long-term partnership. And I think sometimes, and that's based on humans, isn't it?
Normally, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I have my doubts with some suppliers, but yes.
Yeah, but you know, again, it's that human relationship that you want, and I think sometimes that reflects back where we are today. That's been difficult to bring down. So look, I'm going to wrap this up because it's been fascinating. We've kind of touched more on supply chain management than I thought we would do, but I think it's been really interesting. So just on that point, your experiences are really broad and deep, and I was going to ask, or actually, if we could just touch on, you know, you talked about your piece about consulting at Gartner, and you also did a stint in the UK Ministry of Defence as Director of Procurement there. What was the differences? Because you've done 14, you know, you've done a long time at Vodafone in getting stuff done and making stuff happen. Then you've moved to consultancy, and then you've moved to government. So I suspect the 3 of them are very different.
Well, MOD was an unbelievable experience. It had its high points and it had its low points. I think the high point was you know, meeting so many different cultures within one organisation. You had Army, Navy, and Air Force, and the civil service at most meetings. So and you know, being with the services people was fantastic. They all have their own cultures. They all have their own ways of. They all have their own banter between services. And you know, quite often you'll be in a meeting and there'll be people in uniform, in battle dress. Particularly when I was working outside London, the norm was for the services people to wear uniform, for the civil servants to wear their own uniform, and just by that you can get an indication of the different cultures that are involved. You then had to consider as well the view of the departments in Whitehall, and it's very interesting. In yesterday's Times, I read a bit about Michael Gove and what he's doing with the civil service. This is right up to the minute. This is yesterday's news, saying that what did he say? Westminster and Whitehall tend to be in a bubble or tend to be in their own thing, and you know, frankly, when you're somewhere like the MOD, which has staff all over the world doing some things that are public and some things that are not public, and has vast amounts of staff in the UK in all sorts of different areas, Whitehall does seem quite remote. And when you're controlling large numbers of people and huge budgets as the people who look after all defence procurement at Abbey Wood do and in Bristol. You know, they're building destroyers, they're building aircraft carriers, you know, and the budgets are enormous. It seems a very long way from Whitehall sometimes. I was involved in running the government's largest IT budget, a number of billions of pounds, and we had some really good people who were doing that, and quite often the advice we would get from government would be, shall we say, hard to reconcile. You'd have one department insisting that you did things the way you said you were going to do them 5 years ago, and another department insisting that you change things and do things absolutely in a new way, and you absolutely not to use those processes you used 5 years ago. So there was an awful lot of putting different cultures into the same room and making it work. And I think we did make it work for a while. There was some fantastic leadership from the IT director at the time, and we made great strides. And one of the things that I was proudest of was that we saved a number of hundreds of millions of pounds from the public purse without sacking anybody, without using consultants, just by using fantastic civil servants and giving them their head and telling them to go nuts, and to, if they didn't believe something a supplier was telling them, then to just say no. And that did. I'm very, very proud of that we used ordinary, normal people to do something that was beyond the ability of some quite high paid consultants. That's my MOD speech.
Brilliant. So look, I'm conscious of time, Rob, so I'm going to try and start ramping this down, if that's okay. I'm going to ask you with one question. The last question I'm going to leave you with is, for anybody listening who's not as experienced and had the successful career that you have to date, is if there's a piece of advice that you've been given that you've lived by that's helped you in your career.
I've had some great bosses. I think some bosses who endeared themselves to me, and some who were just great bosses. I think Terry Schooling at Dixons was a fantastic boss. He was a bit of a figure of fun for everybody else, but the guy understood what it was all about, and he was the first person for me who really introduced the concept that the people who know the most about what you're trying to do are likely to be the people who sit in front of the customer every day, all day, every day. And because of that, because of his insistence on that, when I built my first IT department, was my very own, for a company, for a Vodafone company that ran a call center, I put the IT department in the middle of the call center so that they could not help but hear their systems being used 40 hours a week, well, 60, 70 hours a week by the call center staff. They had to walk past the call center staff and listen to what they were doing. And that was a really big lesson that Terry taught me. And because of that, when we came to implement a new billing system, I did it with some really great people who I took straight out of the call center and put them into my IT development team as business analysts to get the system up and running. So it's not, the management are likely to know the least about the way systems work, and the people who are in the front line are likely to know the most.
Thanks, Rob. That's been really fascinating. I feel that there's a leadership conversation to be had at another time as well, based on your experiences, but that's great. It's something that I've never heard of before. But and I hope everybody listening have got lots of takeaways today. I mean, I certainly did, and I was just hosting, so that's fantastic. So look, with that, thank you very much. Look, good luck in the future. I hope we can do something together. I'll also see if we can get you on again, and if you don't mind, we'll be okay to share your details at the end of this, so that if people have any follow-up questions or want to contact you, they've got your contact details.
Yeah, it's very simple. rob.lees@gmail.com. Drop me a line.
Brilliant.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, Rob.
Cheers.